Rome, late 2nd century AD. The marble walls of the Palatine shone under the sunlight, reflecting the wealth of an empire that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the damp lands of Britain. Behind those gleaming walls, where luxury and power seemed eternal, a story was taking shape, so dark that many tried to erase it from collective memory. In those silent corridors, an 11-year-old boy walked with hesitant steps. His name was Publius Septimius Geta, son of Emperor Septimius Severus and the influential Julia Domna. At his side, his older brother, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known as Caracalla, guided him with a mixture of roughness and domination. At first glance, it was a fraternal scene. In truth, it was the prelude to a tragedy. That moment would mark the beginning of a heartbreaking destiny. Geta, the younger, was a curious child, fond of books and philosophy, while Caracalla already displayed the brutality of a future tyrant. Two natures, as opposed as they were irreconcilable, had been born under the same roof, and soon they would clash not only for their father's approval but for the dominion of Rome itself. Behind the palace doors, imperial grandeur concealed secrets that no official historian dared to clearly record. Yet the fragments that survived, in inscriptions, partial chronicles, and private letters, allow us to reconstruct a tale of ambition, rivalry, and blood. This is not merely the narration of a dynastic quarrel. It is the X-ray of an empire that, in its effort to uphold absolute power, ended up fueling the most destructive passions of its rulers. It is the story of how the dream of perpetuating a dynasty led Rome to lose part of its soul. And it all began with two brothers whose childhood was marked by the shadow of suspicion and the burden of an inheritance they could never truly share. In the heart of the imperial palace, where halls were adorned with mosaics of ancient heroes and gardens exhaled the fragrance of laurels and roses, the two sons of Septimius Severus grew up under very different gazes. Caracalla, born in 188, soon revealed a fierce temperament. From his earliest years, courtiers described him as irritable, impatient, and dangerously inclined toward violence. He did not enjoy the innocent games of childhood. Instead, he preferred training with wooden weapons, mock fights, and any activity that allowed him to assert dominance over others. The military instructors, impressed by his discipline, treated him like a miniature soldier. Geta, on the other hand, born barely a year later, seemed to belong to another world. His character was more introspective and sensitive. He spent hours listening to tutors read Greek philosophers, copying verses from poets, and practicing rhetoric. Where Caracalla sought the glory of combat, Geta found fascination in intellectual debates and the serenity of books. While one trained to dominate bodies, the other prepared to conquer minds. Soon, the court began to murmur. Servants, attentive to every gesture, noticed that Caracalla openly despised his brother's calm nature, accusing him of softness, weakness, and unfitness for the throne. Geta, for his part, learned to remain silent and evasive, retreating into libraries and avoiding his elder brother's company whenever possible. This was not innocent rivalry, but a dynamic shaped by intimidation. In this environment, the role of Julia Domna was crucial. Mother of both, a cultured woman of enormous influence in Rome's philosophical circles, she tried to balance the scales. She encouraged Geta's education and surrounded him with teachers who nurtured his curiosity, while also celebrating Caracalla's bravery on the training field. She knew both represented the dynasty's future and, with diplomacy, sought to prevent their differences from becoming a threat. However, their father's constant absence worsened the tension. Septimius Severus, preoccupied with military campaigns that carried his name to the farthest corners of the empire, rarely witnessed his son's disputes. When he returned, he misinterpreted Geta's signs of submission as respect for his elder brother, without realizing they were in fact reflections of fear. Thus, in the courtyards and halls of the palace, a silent rivalry was brewing that would soon erupt. Childhood games turned into struggles for power, and each gesture from one was perceived by the other as a threat. No one in Rome knew it yet, but that enmity was destined to divide not only a family but an entire empire. As the two young princes grew, the contrast between them became more evident, and with it, speculation about the empire's future. In a Rome accustomed to seeing power decided by intrigues, civil wars, or favoritism, dynastic succession was a matter laden with tension. Senators, always alert to movements within the imperial family, began to divide in opinion. Some saw Caracalla as the natural heir, strong, audacious, molded for war, and capable of inspiring fear in his enemies. Others, however, believed Geta, with his intelligence, prudence, and philosophical education, represented the stability Rome needed after decades of turbulence. These murmurings inevitably reached the brothers' ears. Caracalla, quick-tempered, interpreted any suggestion in favor of Geta as a direct threat. He could not bear to imagine that the younger might rob him of primacy, and each day he grew more possessive of the place he believed was his by right. Geta, by contrast, did not seek open confrontation. His personality, more inclined to reflection than dispute, led him to avoid direct clashes. But his very existence, with virtues admired by many, was enough to irritate his elder brother. Thus a vicious cycle formed. The more Geta stood out for his intellect and serenity, the more aggressive Caracalla became in his bid to impose authority. Amid this tension, Septimius Severus played an ambiguous role. Hardened by battles and convinced that strength was the foundation of power, the emperor saw in Caracalla the ideal successor. Yet he could not ignore Geta's qualities, whose sound judgment and grasp of politics reminded him of the great philosopher-emperors. In an attempt to maintain peace, Severus decided to bet on an unprecedented formula, that both would share power as co-emperors in the future. The idea, practical in appearance, only deepened the rift. To Caracalla, it was nothing but a disguised threat. It meant his absolute authority would have to be divided, and worse still, shared with the brother he despised. For Geta, the proposal represented recognition of his worth, but it also placed him at the center of a storm of resentment that could no longer be stopped. The seed of tragedy had been sown. Rome was preparing for a future in which the rivalry between two brothers would not remain a private matter but would drag the Senate, the army, and millions of subjects into an inevitable conflict. The year 211 marked a turning point in the history of Rome and in the lives of the two imperial princes. Septimius Severus, after nearly 2 decades on the throne, died in Eboracum, modern-day York in Britain, while leading a campaign against the northern tribes. The emperor, sick and weakened, had brought his 2 sons with him so they could witness firsthand how an army was commanded on the frontier. News of his death spread like lightning throughout the empire. With Severus past the leader who had reunified Rome after years of civil wars, a hard, pragmatic man absolutely convinced that power had to be sustained through military discipline. Yet his most dangerous legacy was not his conquests, but the political inheritance he left to his 2 sons. On his deathbed, according to chroniclers such as Cassius Dio, Severus uttered a warning that would remain etched in memory: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and don't trouble yourselves about anyone else. It was advice laced with cynicism and realism, unity between brothers, generosity toward the army, and disregard for the civilian elites. The problem was that harmony had never existed between Caracalla and Geta. In accordance with the late emperor's wishes, both were proclaimed co-emperors. A decision that outwardly sought to guarantee dynastic continuity, but in reality condemned Rome to division. Caracalla and Geta shared the title of Augustus, the imperial purple, and the official rituals. Yet behind this facade, each began to build his own circle of power. The army, the empire's fundamental pillar, became the first arena of dispute. The soldiers admired Caracalla's toughness and martial leadership, seeing him as a born commander. Geta, though less charismatic on the battlefield, attracted officers who valued his prudence and ability to negotiate with the provinces. The Senate, meanwhile, split into factions. Some preferred the stability offered by Geta, while others placed their bets on Caracalla's strength and determination. Even daily life in the palace reflected this division. The brothers, unable to coexist, went so far as to physically separate their spaces within the Palatine. It is said that they ordered the imperial halls divided with makeshift walls to avoid crossing paths. The government of Rome literally became 2 courts coexisting under the same roof. Meanwhile, Julia Domna, their mother, tried to contain the storm. As Augusta and an influential advisor, she acted as mediator, seeking harmony that slipped through her fingers. She knew her son's enmity could drag the entire empire into chaos, but even her intelligence and experience were not enough to stop a hatred that had been incubating since childhood. The legacy of Severus, instead of uniting the imperial family, turned into a deadly trap. Rome had gone from having a strong, centralized emperor to living under the divided rule of two brothers incapable of trusting each other. And as in so many Roman stories, that tension could only be resolved with blood. After the death of Septimius Severus, Rome entered an unprecedented stage. For the first time in a long while, supreme power was divided between two Augusti. Caracalla and Geta officially shared the throne, but in practice ruled as irreconcilable enemies. What in appearance was meant to be a duo ensuring the empire's stability became a stage of constant suspicion. Every political decision, every speech in the Senate, and every decree signed was seen as a battlefield where the brothers competed to prove superiority. The imperial palace became a fractured space. Caracalla, with his explosive temperament and aura of a military commander, dominated the soldiers and ensured that the Praetorian Guard, the force that could make or break emperors, was under his control. Geta, more reserved and calculating, tried to build a government supported by the civil administration, intellectual advisors, and senators who viewed him as a more stable and reasonable figure. Tensions reached such a point that, according to Herodian, the brothers even avoided eating together or attending ceremonies in common. On the rare occasions they appeared in public together, their rigid faces revealed the contempt they felt. Inside the palace, the physical separation became a symbol of their enmity. The walls built between their apartments were a tangible reflection of the political fracture spreading throughout the empire. The Roman people, always attentive to the gestures of power, perceived this division with growing concern. The streets of Rome and the farthest provinces began to fill with rumors: which of the two was the true emperor? Who could guarantee peace and prosperity? Imperial officials, trapped in the middle of this rivalry, were forced to take sides, for supporting one meant becoming the enemy of the other. There were many attempts at mediation, and among them the figure of Julia Domna stood out. The Empress Mother, who had accompanied her husband on military campaigns and in political life, desperately tried to maintain peace between her sons. It is said that she organized private meetings, tried to soften Caracalla's character, and reminded Geta of the duty of concord. But her efforts were useless. The hatred was too deep, and the idea of sharing the throne intolerable to both. The situation became untenable. Each brother began planning how to eliminate the other. Caracalla's supporters suggested a quick, brutal strike to consolidate his rule. Geta's advisors recommended protecting himself, surrounding himself with guards, and waiting for the right opportunity to tip power in his favor. All of Rome seemed to live under an air of conspiracy, as though at any moment blood would be spilled in the palace halls. The empire, which stretched across 3 continents, was ruled by 2 men who could not share the same table. And in the cruel logic of imperial Rome, everyone knew the outcome was inevitable: only one would survive. The tension between the 2 Augusti reached its climax in the winter of 211. After months of unbearable rivalry, all Rome awaited the outcome. The people saw the brothers as 2 wolves trapped in the same cage, and everyone knew peace could not last. The plan was hatched with chilling precision. Caracalla, convinced that the only way out was to eliminate Geta, arranged a meeting in the private apartments of their mother, Julia Domna. The excuse was noble: a reconciliation meeting, a gesture to heal differences and ensure the unity of the empire. The empress, always eager to see her sons in harmony, agreed to mediate. But what was presented as a pact of peace was in reality a deadly trap. When Geta entered the room, trusting in his mother's authority and accompanied only by a few servants, he was immediately surrounded by guards loyal to Caracalla. The scene, described by Herodian and Cassius Dio, is one of the most brutal in imperial history. The young emperor was mercilessly stabbed as he sought refuge in his mother's arms. Julia Domna, desperate, tried to protect him, but could only hold him as life slipped away. Geta's blood stained her tunic and the palace floor, turning the promised reconciliation into a sacrifice. He was only 22 years old when he was murdered, and his death marked the end of any pretense of concord. The fratricide was not a hidden crime, it was a calculated display. Caracalla wanted everyone to know he had chosen the most ruthless path to secure the throne. From that moment he became the sole emperor of Rome, but also a man haunted by the shadow of his brother. It was not enough to kill Geta. His memory had to be destroyed. Caracalla ordered one of the most systematic campaigns of damnatio memoriae in all of Roman history. Geta's name and image were erased from inscriptions, statues, and monuments. Official documents were altered, coins were melted down, and portraits in frescoes and mosaics were scraped away or replaced. The goal was clear, to make it as if the youngest of the Severins had never existed. The repression was equally brutal. More than 20,000 of Geta's supporters and followers were executed in the months following his death, from senators to soldiers and servants. It was a purge designed to ensure that no voice would rise to question the legitimacy of the new emperor. But violence could not erase memory. The echo of the murder remained engraved in the collective consciousness. People whispered that Caracalla was a fratricide, a ruler who had betrayed not only his family's blood but the very essence of Rome. And although the stones spoke in silence, chroniclers and witnesses kept the tragedy alive. The palace had been the stage of an atrocious crime, and all of Rome understood that from that day on, the empire was ruled by a man who had sacrificed his own brother on the altar of absolute power. After the assassination of Geta in December of 211, Rome awoke to a new reality: the empire was in the hands of a single man, Caracalla, the fratricide. What had begun as an act of political survival became the indelible mark of his reign. Caracalla assumed absolute power with the same ferocity with which he had taken his brother's life. The first months were filled with fear and repression. Palace corridors were thick with rumors, senators walked with caution, and noble families, many tainted by their closeness to Geta, learned that a misinterpreted gesture could cost them their lives. The emperor trusted no one. His mother, Julia Domna, continued to occupy a prominent place at court, but their relationship was forever changed. She, who had witnessed one son kill the other in her own arms, became the perpetual witness of Rome's deepest wound. And though Caracalla respected her as an advisor, between them lay a silence heavy with guilt and resentment. Politically, Caracalla showed pragmatism. He knew Geta's murder had left scars, and that he needed to consolidate authority with more than terror. In 212, he enacted one of the most famous measures in imperial history, the Constitutio Antoniniana, a decree that extended Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire. Officially, it was presented as a gesture of inclusion and unity, but in practice it also served fiscal purposes, expanding the base of taxpayers. At the same time, Caracalla sought to shape his image as a new Alexander the Great. He admired the Macedonian conqueror to the point of imitating his dress, his gestures, and his style of rule. He ordered military campaigns in the east, convinced he could match his idol's glories. Yet his ambitions collided with reality. The empire was no longer the young, expansive organism of centuries past, but a heavy machine barely able to sustain its borders. The echo of the tragedy with Geta followed him even on campaign. The soldiers obeyed him, but many looked at him with suspicion. Chroniclers recount that at night Caracalla suffered nightmares in which he saw his brother's bloodied face. Some claimed he avoided sleeping in the rooms where Geta had spent his childhood, as if fearing his spirit still haunted the palace walls. The emperor tried to silence these ghosts with grand projects and public works. Among them, the baths of Caracalla stood out, a monumental complex that became a symbol of his reign. These imperial baths could host thousands of citizens, a space combining luxury, advanced engineering, and political propaganda. Through such works, Caracalla sought to present himself as a benefactor of the people, someone who, despite the cruelty of his rise, could offer greatness to Rome. Yet behind the magnificence, violence persisted. His paranoia led him to execute thousands, from suspicious generals to common citizens accused of treason. The shadow of fratricide had opened a wound in his mind, and to protect himself from real and imagined enemies, he answered with blood. In the eyes of the Senate and the people, Caracalla was feared more than loved. Some remembered him as a relentless warrior, others as a tyrant. But all agreed that Geta's murder had marked a turning point. Rome was no longer ruled by a legitimate heir, but by a man who had reached the throne through the most impious crime, the killing of his own brother. The echo of that tragedy could not be erased, not even with decrees, monuments, or conquests. Caracalla's reign became a desperate attempt to justify his power and redeem himself before history, though every step dragged him deeper into the dark legend of the Severan dynasty. Caracalla's fate seemed sealed from the very moment the dagger pierced his brother's body. That crime, more than a political victory, was an invisible sentence that followed him until his last day. He ruled Rome with an iron hand, built grand monuments, and extended citizenship to millions, but behind that mask of power hid an emperor consumed by paranoia and the memory of Geta. In the following years, his reign was marked by endless military campaigns. Caracalla found in war a refuge from the ghosts that haunted him at the palace. In Germania, he marched with his legions to crush rebellions and present himself as an invincible leader. In Dacia, he pushed the frontiers with blood and iron. But it was in the east, where he sought to emulate his idol Alexander the Great, that his ambition overflowed. In 214, he set out for Asia Minor and Syria, proclaiming his desire to conquer Persia. The army followed, but many officers whispered in secret about the emperor's instability. They said he spoke alone in his tent, awoke startled at night calling for Geta, and ordered sacrifices in foreign temples in search of an impossible redemption. His obsession with Alexander even led him to visit Troy and pay homage to the hero Achilles, as if he hoped to find in those rites an absolution that Rome would never grant him. The campaign against childbirth, however, turned into a disaster. Caracalla achieved some initial advances, but his excesses betrayed him. In the city of Alexandria, Egypt, he ordered an unprecedented massacre after suspecting that its inhabitants were mocking him with satires about the murder of Geta. Thousands died in a single day. The emperor could not tolerate the memory of his brother, and wherever a shadow of his remembrance arose, he responded with fire and blood. But absolute power has limits when it feeds only on fear. Among the soldiers and senators, silent conspiracies began to grow. One of the men closest to the emperor, Marcus Opellius Macrinus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, understood that Caracalla's permanence threatened the stability of the empire. Macrinus had witnessed the fratricide and taken part in the complicit silences that surrounded it, but now he saw in the emperor's elimination both a political and personal escape. In 217, while Caracalla was campaigning in Mesopotamia, fate finally caught up with him. On a journey to the temple of the goddess Luna, in Cari, he stopped to urinate along the road. It was a trivial, almost ridiculous moment for a man who had ruled through terror. It was then that a soldier of his own guard, a conspirator in Macrinus's plot, approached and stabbed him. The emperor fell to the ground without glory, murdered not in battle, but in the vulnerable intimacy of routine. He was only 29 years old. His death was secretly celebrated by many and mourned only by a few. Rome had lost an emperor, but it had gained an eternal tale about the fragility of power. Macrinus proclaimed himself emperor, justifying the crime as a necessity to save the empire. However, the echo of fratricide never faded. The story of Caracalla became inseparably bound to that of Geta. The murder of the younger brother was not only the beginning of his power but also the seed of his downfall. The Roman people, superstitious and fond of omens, interpreted the tragedy as divine punishment for the spilling of family blood. Neither his military victories, nor his colossal baths, nor his legal reforms could erase that stain. Thus ended the life of a man who wanted to be Alexander but was remembered as a fratricide. Rome, which had so often glorified strength and conquest, found in this tragedy a warning: power born of betrayal is destined to devour itself. And in the marbles of the Palatine, where it all began, the echo of young Geta's footsteps still seemed to resonate, as a reminder that even in the heart of the most powerful empire in history, unchecked ambition could destroy everything. After Geta's death, Rome witnessed one of the most relentless censorship campaigns in its history. Caracalla, determined to erase any trace of his brother, ordered the most feared punishment of Roman tradition, damnatio memoriae. It was not enough to kill him, he had to be erased from collective memory as well. Geta's statues were destroyed or recarved to represent other members of the imperial family. His portraits and frescoes were scraped away, his inscriptions chiseled out, and even the coins bearing his image were withdrawn from circulation and melted down. It was as if Caracalla wanted to rewrite the past, convinced that by eliminating his brother's memory, he would secure his own future. Yet repression did not stop at marble and bronze. It extended also to the written word. Official archives were purged, imperial chroniclers were ordered to omit or distort events, and senators who had personally known Geta were pressured into silence under threat of death. Fear became the invisible ink with which history was rewritten. But damnatio memoriae rarely achieved the goal of completely erasing its victims. On the contrary, such attempts at total elimination often aroused more suspicion among those living in Rome. Whispers in the streets, comments in the forums, and rumors in taverns wove a parallel narrative beyond official control. Everyone knew that Geta had been murdered by his own brother, and that the imperial machinery was bent on hiding the truth. The historian Cassius Dio, who witnessed Caracalla's excesses firsthand, left veiled references to the fratricide in his writings. He could not write it openly without risking his life, but between the lines he left clues that survived through time. Others, like Herodian, wrote after Caracalla's death and offered more direct accounts, though still tinged with caution. The erasure of Geta from collective memory was not only an act of personal cruelty but also a political strategy. Caracalla needed to consolidate his image as the sole legitimate heir of Septimius Severus. The existence of Geta, even in death, represented a dangerous shadow, a reminder that imperial power should have been shared, and that Rome had lost a ruler many considered more just and promising. Paradoxically, the attempt to erase Geta ended up granting him a different kind of immortality. The violence with which Caracalla sought to eliminate him became proof of his existence. Every erased inscription, every mutilated statue, every forced silence spoke louder than any intact monument. Geta's memory survived in the absences, in the gaps, in the visible scars left by the chisels of imperial workmen. Rome had shown it could erase faces from coins and names from inscriptions, but it could not uproot the truth, that an emperor had killed his own brother, and that an entire empire had been complicit in that silence. The murder of Geta is not only a dark episode in the history of Rome, it is also a mirror in which we can see reflected the eternal dynamics of power. On the surface, it appears a distant tale, two brothers clashing over the inheritance of a throne in an empire that no longer exists. But beneath that surface, patterns emerge that transcend centuries. Caracalla and Geta symbolize the tension between ambition and fraternity, between the thirst for dominion and the need for justice. Fratricide reminds us that absolute power tends to devour even the most sacred bonds, and that systems built on fear and complicity are doomed to rot from within. The attempt to erase Geta's memory shows another fundamental lesson: truth can be hidden, but rarely destroyed. Though Caracalla ordered inscriptions erased, coins melted, and witnesses silenced, history survived in fragments, whispered through time, preserved in texts that escaped censorship. In the end, what was meant to be buried emerged centuries later with greater force, as an uncomfortable testimony of what limitless ambition means. Today, in a world where institutions still grapple with abuses of power, cover-ups, and conspiracies of silence, Geta's tragedy speaks to us with a surprisingly modern voice. It reminds us that institutional complicity can be as destructive as the crime itself, that denial is a form of violence, and that silence, when it shields the powerful, always becomes a sentence for the vulnerable. Rome's echo resounds in our own societies. Every time an inconvenient truth is suppressed, every time a victim is silenced in the name of stability, every time power triumphs over justice, we repeat, in our own way, the tragedy of Geta. The marble of the Palatine no longer holds the footsteps of those two princes, but the story remains alive, reminding us that the greatness of an empire, or of any nation, is not measured only in conquests, laws, or monuments, but in its ability to protect human dignity. And when that capacity is lost, what dies is not only a person, but the very soul of civilization.